Okay, so the mechanics of breathing. If you recall, respiration is a four-part process, and the first part of that is pulmonary ventilation, or breathing. So how does that work? Well, in order to understand that, we should understand some pressure relationships in the thoracic cavity. First, we just need to know about pressure at all, and this is all physics stuff, so we're going to take it very light, because you know how I feel about physics. I mean, it's great, but only at the law level. As far as pressure relationships go, like everything in life, gases want to move from high to low pressure. We're going to be talking about air, which is a mixture of gases, so there's 100% of air out there, and we're only going to be talking about the movement of two gases in that air, oxygen and CO2. So we're going to talk about partial pressures for the partial pressure gradients that they're following, but we're not going to go into a whole lot of nitty-gritty detail. So what do we need to be aware of for pressure relationships in the thoracic cavity? First, that gases, like everything, want to move from high to low pressure. Gases want to move from high pressure to low pressure. So, if we think about it, we're going to have to think about a couple things. That, let's just say that we've got 100% of air, and primarily what do we have? We've got like nitrogen, oxygen, CO2, water. I think those, now I'm not a chemist. I feel about chemistry like I do about physics, but I'm pretty sure that's most of all we got in air. And so that's 100% of air. What we're going to talk about is the partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of CO2. So we're only going to look at those two gases, not all of the rest of air. Okay, so that's one thing. And then the next thing that we need to be aware of is, as far as pressure relationships go, is that as the volume of a space holding air decreases, the pressure on that air increases. And as the volume of the space holding air increases, the pressure on that air decreases. What am I talking about? Well, let's imagine that we've got this stationary tube here, and it's got a plunger in it. I'm going to keep it closed off at the top. Our respiratory system is not that way, but this is so we can understand what's going on with pressure. So if I've got this plunger here, and in here I've got 100% of the air at some set pressure, it's all just floating around in there, and now all of a sudden I push this plunger up. What do I do to the volume if I push the plunger up? I decrease it. So I decrease the volume. What do you think that does to the pressure on this air? I'm not letting it out. It increases the pressure. So as I decrease the volume, I increase the pressure. Okay? And air wants to move from high to low pressure. So it's really high here, it's low out here. If this thing were open, it would want to go. It's not open, and I'm not opening it yet. Okay, so now what if I then pull down on my plunger? So as I pull down on my plunger, what do I do to my volume? So as I'm pulling down on my plunger, I'm increasing my volume. So as I increase my volume, all that pressure that it was under is going to decrease. Okay. So there's an inverse relationship between the volume of a container holding a gas and the pressure that the gas is under. All right, so now these are two important things. This fact here, that an increase in volume drops pressure, a decrease in volume increases pressure, and gases always want to go from high to low pressure. So what can we do to make this breathing thing happen? We can contract our diaphragm. So, intrapulmonary pressure is the pressure within the lungs. Intra, within the lungs. So intrapulmonary pressure changes throughout the respiratory cycle. So intrapulmonary pressure is the pressure in the lungs. And we'll say it changes throughout pulmonary ventilation. I heard you. You just told me to change markers. I'll do it. You can't see that. What it says is that intrapulmonary pressure is pressure in the lungs, and it changes throughout pulmonary ventilation. Hello, welcome to my coronavirus classroom. I'm Janessa Jacobs, and the doctor is in to fix up these lectures. So when thinking about the movement of air throughout the respiratory cycle, we need to be aware of pressures, 3 pressures, and the ways that they're changing. So gas wants to move from high to low pressure. So what are the 3 pressures we need to worry about? Atmospheric pressure is the pressure of all of the air on the atmosphere down on you. And that is not going to change from one breath to the next. So atmospheric pressure is the pressure of all of the gases and air on you. And this is not going to change. So this doesn't change throughout pulmonary ventilation. Okay, the next pressure that is going to change throughout pulmonary ventilation is intrapulmonary pressure, or the pressure within your lungs. As you recall from the previous description of pressure relationships, as the volume holding a gas increases, the pressure on that gas decreases. That's what happens when the diaphragm contracts. It decreases intrapulmonary pressure by increasing intrapulmonary volume. Then when the diaphragm relaxes and pushes back up into the lungs, it decreases intrapulmonary volume, so it increases intrapulmonary pressure. So that change in pressure is going to guide the movement of air, and that's what's going to be changing throughout our respiratory cycle. So intrapulmonary pressure is the pressure of the air in the lungs due to changes in intrapulmonary volume. So the pressure on air in the lungs due to volume changes in the thorax, or we'll say due to volume changes throughout pulmonary ventilation. And then the last pressure is intrapleural pressure. And this is a negative pressure that changes in the same way as intrapulmonary pressure, so it has no effect on the movement of air into or out of the lungs. What intrapleural pressure does is keeps the lungs inflated. So you may have heard that people they've broken a rib and collapsed a lung. Well, what happened is that the lung recoiled due to the elasticity in the lung, and the reason that happened is because that intrapleural pressure was disrupted. So when you break a rib, it punctures the pleural membranes and disrupts that intrapleural pressure, so then the lungs recoil and collapse. Okay, so intrapleural pressure is the negative pressure due to the relationship of the pleural membranes to the thorax, and it's going to change continuously with intrapulmonary pressure. All it's really going to do is keep the lungs inflated. Intrapleural pressure. Negative pressure in the pleural cavity. Pleural cavities that keeps the lungs inflated. All right, back to your other recording. That's inspiration and expiration. So inspiration, as I've said, is the only active part of breathing. And what happens during inspiration is your diaphragm contracts. Your external intercostal muscles also help with inspiration. Inspiration is also called inhalation. And what happens is that when your diaphragm is relaxed, it's pushing up on your lungs, and then it contracts and it pushes down on your abdominal organs and out on your thorax. Your external intercostals contract and push out on your thorax. So all of that, what do you think it does to the volume in the lungs? You're right, it increases the volume in the lungs. So we get an increase in intrapulmonary volume. And so if we increase the volume, what do we do to the pressure? You're right, we decrease intrapulmonary pressure, and it is less than atmospheric pressure. So intrapulmonary pressure will drop. We'll drop our intrapulmonary pressure. Now wait a minute. What did I just say about atmospheric pressure? I lost it on my PowerPoint, otherwise I would have remembered to tell you about it. So what happens now is intrapulmonary pressure is going to drop. Atmospheric pressure is going to be greater than intrapulmonary pressure, and you'll breathe in. Air will flow in through all of your conducting zone structures into the respiratory zone, and gas exchange can happen. So during inspiration, what we could say is the diaphragm contracts. That increases intrapulmonary volume, which drops intrapulmonary pressure. So atmospheric pressure is greater than intrapulmonary pressure, and air flows into the lungs. What? Diaphragm contracts. Intrapulmonary volume increases. So intrapulmonary pressure decreases. It becomes less than atmospheric pressure. And air does what gases want to do. It moves from an area of high pressure to low pressure, and air flows into the lungs. So intrapulmonary pressure decreases, is less than atmospheric pressure, and air flows into the lungs. All right. All right, what happens during expiration? During expiration, your diaphragm relaxes. And so it's a dome-shaped muscle. When it relaxes, it's going to push up into your lungs. So our diaphragm relaxes, pushes up into the lungs. What do you think that does to intrapulmonary volume? You're right, it decreases intrapulmonary volume, which is going to do what to intrapulmonary pressure? It's going to increase intrapulmonary pressure. And now intrapulmonary pressure will be greater than atmospheric pressure. And you'll breathe out because air will go from high pressure in the lungs to low pressure in the atmosphere, and that's expiration. So what we could say is the diaphragm relaxes, your external intercostal muscles relax, so they will, the thorax will depress some. If you want to force expiration, you can contract your internal intercostal to push out a little more air. But in normal respiration, what's happening is your diaphragm relaxes. This is going to push up on the lungs, which will decrease intrapulmonary volume, which will increase intrapulmonary pressure. So now intrapulmonary pressure will be greater than atmospheric pressure. So air wants to move from high pressure to low pressure, and air will flow out of the lungs. Through the bronchial tree, up the trachea, through the larynx, up the pharynx, past your nasal cavity and out your nose. All right. Now, these pressure changes in expiration are pretty big. So what causes these tiny little air sacs not to just fold onto themselves and stay closed? Well, it's alveolar surface tension. So if you think about it, or what occurs in the alveolus because of surfactant. So water has a really, really high surface tension. And what does that mean? Well, we've all belly flopped. Maybe you haven't. If you haven't, you're smart. But if you think about it, here you are on your diving board, and if you just like dive off, and instead of making your nice swan dive, you hit the water flat. Oh man, does it hurt. Belly flops hurt. It's because the surface tension of water is very high. So in order for our alveoli not to collapse on themselves, we have to do something to decrease the surface tension of water. And that's where surfactant comes into play. So surfactant, secreted by those type 2 alveolar cells, decreases the surface tension of water so that our alveolus can stay inflated instead of collapsing under that surface tension. The body is an aqueous environment. We're surrounded by interstitial fluid. So if that alveolus was just an empty sac, then when you breathed out, that mucus that's coating those cells would collapse and you'd stick together. You wouldn't be able to reinflate. So surfactant fills the alveolus and decreases the surface tension of water. That seems a little weird, so make sure if you're ever doing something like taking a test and it asks you about the function of surfactant, it's to decrease the surface tension of water. So alveolar surface tension, we'll say that we decrease, or surfactant, produced by our type 2 alveolar cells, decreases the surface tension in the alveolus, so that it does not collapse. Okay, so that was pulmonary ventilation. Now let's talk about the second part of respiration that's handled by the respiratory system, external gas exchange. So our lungs are going to do external gas exchange. Our respiratory gases are going to be transported into the blood to the tissues where we'll do internal gas exchange or internal respiration. So let's talk about this. So composition of alveolar gas. It has 100% of the stuff. Nitrogen, oxygen, CO2, water. We're going to care about CO2 and oxygen. So just worry about that. Composition of alveolar gas is that it's got 100% of the air in it. And we're going to worry about the partial pressures of oxygen and CO2. Okay, so external respiration. This is alveolar gas exchange. So this is gas exchange at the level of the lungs. So alveolar gas exchange. And remember, our gases are going to move down their partial pressure gradients. So we're just going to imagine this is my gas exchange line. So this is before gas exchange, and this is after gas exchange at the level of the lungs. So this is before external respiration, this is after external respiration. So I'm just going to draw one vessel, one capillary, but you're going to imagine that it's a capillary bed. And you know what capillary beds look like. There's a lot of capillaries in there. So, what type of vessel is bringing the blood into the capillary bed? It's a pulmonary arteriole, and it has deoxygenated blood in it. And it's going to drain into our pulmonary capillaries. We'll have gas exchange, and our pulmonary venules are going to pick up our oxygenated blood after gas exchange. So over here, we've got deoxygenated blood is coming in from the pulmonary circuit. So this is deoxygenated blood. What does that mean? That it's got a low partial pressure of oxygen. okay? And it's got a high partial pressure of CO2. Okay? Well, what's going on in my alveolus? If I look at my alveolar air, then the air that I just breathed in through inspiration has a high partial pressure of oxygen and a low partial pressure of CO2. So my gases are going to be exchanged down their pressure gradients. And oxygen is going to go from high in the lungs to low in the blood. And CO2 is going to go from high in the blood to low in the lungs. And now I've had external respiration, or alveolar gas exchange. So if I look at this blood then that's entering my pulmonary venules to drain into my pulmonary veins, it now has a high partial pressure of oxygen and a low partial pressure of CO2. We would call this oxygenated blood that's on its way back to the systemic circuit to get pumped out to the tissues. So that is external respiration. So after this, what now does the alveolar air look like? It's high in CO2, high partial pressure of CO2, it's got a low partial pressure of oxygen, and now we can breathe off that CO2. Welcome to Negative Feedback with Chip by Janessa Jacobs. In this negative feedback loop, we'll describe what happens when you breathe too quickly, therefore decreasing CO2 levels in your body because you're breathing off CO2 instead of retaining it. Hey, good. What's up? Remember that time you had to give that speech to all those other angels? Yeah, so... Remember how nervous you got? You turned as red as me. Yeah, so... You were sweating so much it made your wings glisten. Yeah, so... And much like now, you were breathing so fast you felt like you were going to pass out. Yeah, bag. No bag, we're riding this through to the end. Reflex, baby. You see, Good has a fear of public speaking. He passed out the last time and was traumatized by the experience. So we can really replay that moment right here, right now. Good is breathing so fast his CO2 is dropping outside the normal range. This decrease in CO2 will be detected by chemoreceptors in his brainstem. His brainstem will send out a message and constrict blood vessels in his brain. The decrease in O2 availability will cause him to pass out. In 3, 2, 1... And now, his autonomic nervous system will take over to slow and deepen his breathing. He'll stop breathing off all his CO2, and in no time at all, he'll be back to homeostasis. Dude, you really are a devil. What about at the level of the tissues? What's going on at the tissues? So the tissues are oxygenated blood. It's coming in from the systemic circuit. So if we look at this capillary bed now, we've got a little meta-arterial that's draining into it, bringing in oxygenated blood. So it's got a high partial pressure of oxygen and a low partial pressure of CO2. Okay, my capillary bed. This is my internal respiration, or my systemic gas exchange. If I look out here in my tissues, here are my tissue cells doing their tissue cell thing. Out here I've got extracellular fluid. In here, this is my blood. So on the arterial side of the capillary bed of the tissues, I'm bringing in my oxygenated blood that has a high partial pressure of oxygen and a low partial pressure of CO2. If I look out here in the tissues, these cells now have a high partial pressure of CO2 and a low partial pressure of oxygen because they used up all their oxygen. And what do they use it to do? Whatever they do. They produce a bunch of CO2. So now I've got to exchange. So what happens? Oxygen moves from high in our systemic blood to low in the tissues. and then my cells are going to take it up pretty darn quickly. So I'll go from high partial pressure in my oxygenated blood to low partial pressure in my tissues. My cells take up that oxygen and use it. I'll move from high CO2 in the tissues to low CO2 in the blood. And now when I look at this blood, it's got a high partial pressure of CO2 and a low partial pressure of oxygen. And now this is the deoxygenated blood that will be collected in the venules that will drain into the veins that ultimately drain back into the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, or coronary sinus. So this is the deoxygenated blood that will return to the pulmonary circuit to be brought back for external respiration. So this is internal respiration or tissue gas exchange. And again, we come into the tissues where we're low in oxygen and high in CO2. We bring our oxygenated blood, high partial pressure of oxygen, low partial pressure of CO2. Oxygen moves from high in the blood to low in the tissues. CO2 moves from high in the tissues to low in the blood. And now this deoxygenated blood goes back to the lungs where it can be breathed off during expiration. So this is our third process of respiration, or the third one we've talked about, 3 of 4. Now let's talk about gas transport. Okay. We're going to do gas transport pretty light. Just because. So, oxygen. What is oxygen transported by? Red blood cells, you're right. Which part of red blood cells? Hemoglobin. Which part of hemoglobin? Heme. Awesome. Okay, so oxygen. 98% of oxygen is bound to heme on hemoglobin when it's transported through the body. So 98% of oxygen is transported bound to the heme of hemoglobin. Okay. 98% of it bound to the hemoglobin. The other 2% is floating free in the blood. All right, what about CO2? CO2 is primarily transported as bicarbonate ion. And that does this whole thing, the chloride ion shift, that can actually have an impact on blood pH, but that's higher level than we're going to go into for this class. So CO2, we'll say 70% is transported as bicarbonate ion. So 70% is transported as bicarbonate ion. What is that? HC3O4. Maybe? I don't know. See, I don't know. Maybe. I think that's it. Yeah, and then the chloride ion shift happens and you get H to the chloride gets kicked out, you get a water and carbonic acid. Yeah, so what happens is that you have this weird chemistry reaction where bicarbonate ion can bounce back and forth and become carbonic acid. So it goes something like this. Our bicarbonate ion goes back and forth in this chemical reaction with carbonic to become, like it goes back and forth, whatever that is called. I'm not a chemist, but we have this kind of chemistry reaction where we go back and forth between bicarbonate ion and carbonic acid. And so CO2 can actually have quite an impact on your blood pH. I don't think that's it. And so then, what's it look like? I'm not doing the chemistry. Okay, then 20% of our hemoglobin is bound, 20% of our CO2 is bound to the other part of hemoglobin, which was globin. So 20% is bound to the globin of hemoglobin. And then the last 10% is free in the blood. Ah, look at that. We're done. So that's all I want you to know for lecture materials for the respiratory system. Stay tuned for the respiratory lab.